Christine Jones, and currently I am the co-chair of the Canadian Peace Alliance with Derek O'Keefe, who's going to be one of our panelists, and we'll introduce Derek in a minute. The first thing I'd like to do is welcome you all here this evening, and we're very grateful that you are able to join us, and we look forward to seeing you all throughout the weekend as well. The first thing that I'd like to do is to take a moment to acknowledge that this building occupies the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations land. As settlers coming together in this space, it is our collective responsibility to respect and regard this land as being the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and to engage each other with respect throughout this convention. I think that it's also really important for us to remember, since we last met, all of those folks and people who have died and been murdered and have been slaughtered because of war and occupation. I think most of us realize that we are living in a privileged situation here in Canada where we don't face the same odds that many of our colleagues do who are part of resistance movements around the world. I'd like to thank, from all of us on the steering committee, the hosting groups for this convention, which are the Canadian Peace Alliance, the Toronto Coalition to Stop the War, and the Ryerson Students' Union. So this is our 25th anniversary, and I think it's really important that we recognize all of those people on whose backs we are able to be here today. There are probably thousands of people from across Canada who in the 25 years of the Canadian Peace Alliance's existence have done work, sometimes toiling away quietly with no recognition, sometimes very recognizable because they've been leading marches or hanging banners from bridges or speaking at rallies. And I think it's really important that we draw strength from those thousands of people, because here we are together, and we are part of the thousands of millions of people around the world who are resisting in profound ways. And I think none of us could deny that this road of resistance that so many of us are on, and in so many unique and creative ways, seems to be gaining strength and to be gaining momentum. And although it's true that it's an exhausting endeavor for a lot of us, I know for myself I take great solace and I get great energy from knowing that it's not just me, that there are people all around Canada doing this kind of work. We may not always see it, but most importantly, I take great solace for all of those who are on the front lines doing resistance and active resistance in ways that we're fortunate right now not to have to do here in Canada. And so I really, really hope, and I think I say this on behalf of the entire steering committee, that this weekend is a time for some serious thought, for some serious debate, but also for serious joy and celebration about what human resistance looks like, and in fact what it can look like down the road. So first I'd like to introduce Judith Leblanc. She's the field director for Peace Action, which is the largest peace network in the United States. She is the former co-chair of the United for Peace and Justice and is a member of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma, and currently lives in Harlem, New York.
I can't tell you how happy I am to be here with you, with the Canadian Peace Alliance, Afghans for Peace, to discuss and talk about where we've come in the last 10 years, but even more important, what we need to do now to end the wars and occupations in Afghanistan and Iraq. And in the time that we have together, I hope that we can share this weekend some ideas, but also make some plans, because I kind of feel like a labor leader who spoke at the Occupy Wall Street rally, union rally that was held last week. And this labor leader said, we have found each other. He was talking about coming together, the labor movement and the occupiers coming together. And I kind of feel with the Canadian Peace Alliance, we have always found each other for decades. And back in the olden days, 20 years ago during the struggle for nuclear disarmament, we found each other. During the Iraq War, we found each other. In support of the resistors, we have found each other. And now we have great struggles to continue to work together on trying to prevent the Keystone XL pipeline. We have to work together to continue the occupations. We have to work together in Chicago when NATO and the G8 come in May 2012. You know, there's been so much has happened in the world in the last 10 years. So much has happened in our movements. 10 years ago, when the war was launched, I was a reporter and I went to Ground Zero, where the World Trade Center was, on the day that the war was launched. And I interviewed an iron worker. And he was one of thousands who were searching in the pile, the smoldering pile, for remains. And I asked him what his reaction was to the launch of the war in Afghanistan. And his reaction was plain and it was simple. He said, 2 wrongs don't make a right. Even while working in the smoldering pile, he knew that war was not the answer. We knew that too. I wasn't a peace activist then, I was a reporter. But that iron worker and the roundups of all the Arab and Muslim people in New York in the weeks and months after 9/11 compelled me and millions of people to become part of the fight for peace and justice. It was a fight then, it is a fight now, and it's even more clear today that peace and justice are inseparable. And now, today, 10 years after that war being launched, I think we're in the beginnings of birthing a new kind of peace and justice movement. Because there's very little possibility for achieving economic and racial justice and ending militarism or having real democracy without peace, without ending militarism, without fundamentally changing U.S. foreign policy and its impact on our communities and communities around the world. Without qualification, I can say that in these last 10 years, our movements are stronger and in a better place. We are positioned now to make fundamental headway because of the blood, the sweat, the tears, the death and the dying of many in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and all across the world. Because in every sense, in every basic sense, the U.S. empire is in decline. The question is, will it wreak more havoc or will the retreat be orderly? That's the question. That's the question our movement building must take up. It's no longer true that the U.S. can call the shots politically, militarily, economically. The first strike, endless war doctrine is not a foregone conclusion, nor is the stability of the economic system. The Arab Spring proved that. The movement building the path that we must take going forward is tricky and it will be tough. But I think the tide is moving in our direction. The birthing of a new kind of peace and justice movement is going on. And let me tell you, birthing is no walk in the park. Can I get an amen from the mothers in the back? Exactly, exactly. So this transition that we're in is going to be tough, but we are in a transition to a new kind of peace and justice movement that is coinciding with the decline of U.S. empire, which in reality we have very little control over. But we can have an impact on it. If our tactics are popular, our political assessments are on time, and we build strategic alliances and relationships. Now that's where we are in the U.S., and I want to share a little bit of our reality. Because gone are the days under the Bush administration when we could send out a few emails and get hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Those were our glory days. Since 2008, since the election, some in the U.S. peace movement have lamented, why don't we have these big peace demonstrations? Some have kept doing the same thing that has been done for decades, meeting and talking with people in our choir. Some saw the impact, personally or in our communities or on the federal budget, of the intense 2007 economic crisis as separate and apart from the wars. Since 2008, some have blamed the election of President Obama for the decline in visible peace activity. The search for the guilty, the finger-pointing, and the recriminations began. Those of us who worked to defeat a presidential candidate who promised to stay in Iraq for 100 years so that we could leave in victory, well, we saw the 2008 elections as a big step forward, no doubt. Those of us who worked to elect President Obama saw the significance of our people overcoming decades, hundreds of years of racism, millions of people crossing that racial divide to elect a black man to the White House as a victory. Now, Obama kept saying over and over, yes, we can. He didn't say, yes, I can, right? And the movements, all of the great movements for social change, all of the great social change that's ever happened in the world has come about because of movements, not presidents. Some people forgot that. And frankly, no electoral victory alone in any country has ever resolved a crisis, including and especially the crisis of the US empire. Some people forgot that too. So the peace movement has had to recalibrate. We've had a lot of movement building. We have a whole lot of movement building to do before we can fundamentally change US foreign policy or domestic policies. But the movement building, the kind of movement building we need to do is not brain surgery. It's not. It's the consistent focus on popular tactics with keen on-time political assessments and strategic alliance building. And in the US, we are taking some small but important steps in that direction. Well, I can't contain myself. Hell, I think we are really on the move, finally, for the first time in 10 years. And the possibilities of finally really ending the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are within reach. 10 years after being a reporter and having spoken to that prophetic ironworker, a supermajority of people in the United States believe that war is not the answer and that the troops need to come home as soon as possible from Iraq and Afghanistan. This year, the U.S. Conference of Mayors passed a resolution calling for the troops and the tax dollars to come home from Afghanistan. They addressed a foreign policy issue for the first time since Vietnam. The AFL-CIO, in response to the devastating federal budget deficit deal, issued a statement which included 2 lines, plain and simple. We must demilitarize foreign policy. The 2 wars were a mistake and are draining the scarce resources needed to deal with joblessness and poverty. It's huge. First time the labor movement has spoken out against the wars since Vietnam. First time in 10 years of this war, 1/3 of the US Senate took a stand for setting a date certain for the withdrawal of all troops from Afghanistan. All of these developments are a result of 10 years of mass demonstrations, nonviolent direct action, popular education, legislative struggles, and electoral engagement. All of these developments are a result of initiatives taken by peace groups, including my own. Yes, these were all developments based on actions that the peace organizations took, but they are also driven by the overriding issue of the economic crisis and the expose of the right wing's program. Poll after public opinion polls show the majority of people in the US now believe that tax cuts for the rich and corporations and the wars caused the federal budget deficit, and they are right. The US economic crisis, the financial bust, the inability of the government to address the crisis are all a reflection of an empire in decline. Now more realize that wars and occupations are a part of the decline of our communities. As Dr. Martin Luther King said during Vietnam, the bombs dropped in Vietnam explode in our communities. It's no longer possible for the US to call the shots. The Arab Spring made that clear, and it is something really to internalize for the peace movement in our country, to know that there are processes that we don't have control of, but that we must impact on. Huge, huge processes. So now at the initiative of a number of national peace groups, including my own Peace Action, we've brought together in the past year a cross-section of labor, faith, community groups, economic and racial justice groups to build this new kind of peace and justice movement that we need. We call ourselves the New Priorities Network. We're trying to grow a movement that calls for moving the money from wars and weapons back to our communities and to repair the damage that U.S. foreign policy has done all across the world. In the last 10 years, the Pentagon budget has doubled, separate and apart from the cost of the wars, doubled. 58% of yearly federal spending goes to new weapons and war planning, separate and apart from the costs of the war. 2% of federal spending goes to education, 3% to transportation, all single digit to take care of human needs, to take care of diplomatic State Department needs. In fact, the right wing right now is calling for massive cuts in funds that pay for diplomacy at a time when we need that most to end the war in Afghanistan. While 25 million people are unemployed or underemployed, 50 million people without health care insurance, more families now live in poverty than in the last 50 years. The policies of the U.S. government, both domestic and foreign, are immoral, and they are wrong. And they are controlled. The policies are controlled, both domestic and foreign policy, by the military-industrial complex and war profiteering. As he left office 50 years ago, President Eisenhower warned the U.S. of the impending danger of the military-industrial complex. That's a phrase he coined, the military-industrial complex. He said every bomb produced takes food from the mouths of the hungry. The ever-increasing Pentagon budget wasn't about national security then, and it's not about national security now. Now the world faces an arms race of one, the U.S. The U.S. is the main arms dealer and spends more on the U.S. military than all the countries of the world combined. The world is hungrier, more impoverished, and less safe than ever. So to challenge the grip of the military-industrial complex over the federal budget and over U.S. foreign policy, it means that we're going to have to build a movement that's going to take years to build. But what I'm saying is that the core elements of such a movement are on the rise today and are an outgrowth of the work that the peace movement has done over the last 10 years. The military-industrial complex is beginning to feel the pressure. You know, across the political spectrum, the debate is raging on rather not to cut military spending, but how much to cut it. So I want to tell you about a dramatic example of the new kind of movement building that we're doing in the U.S. and the mood of the military-industrial complex. You know, in this week, Montgomery County, Maryland, a coalition was brought together about a year ago by Peace Action, brought together labor and community groups to fight a county tax abatement requested by Lockheed Martin, which is the largest arms dealer in the U.S. Lockheed requested this tax abatement just the same week that an announcement of layoffs of firefighters and public workers was made because of county budget problems. Peace Action mobilized community and labor testified at the hearing, and the tax abatement was defeated. New strategic relationships were built between labor and community groups and peace groups, and it was all premised on solidarity with public workers and keeping the elected officials focused on the needs of the community. There were no revolutionary demands. It was simple: change spending priorities, end the wars, bring the war dollars home. That's what we are calling for. That's the kind of movement that we are trying to build, this new kind of movement. Well, this week the county council agreed to vote on such a resolution, a new resolution, a move the money resolution. When Lockheed Martin found out about it this week, they called the county council president, they called the 5 county council members who supported the resolution. they put the scare of Jesus in these county councilors. This was a non-binding resolution that was being brought forward before the county council, and that resolution was pulled. That resolution was pulled, but now this coalition that brought the Move the Money resolution to the county council is gearing up. The fight is on. They're plotting the next steps, but what they've done is they called a press conference outside the county council. The Washington Post covered it. Why? Because it showed that the Lockheed Martin, the military industry, is willing to stifle democracy even when there's just talk about cutting into their war profiteering. This is a magic movement moment, or what Oprah Winfrey likes to call an aha moment. That's the kind of movement we need to organize, grounded in local organizing, taking on the military-industrial complex, and building local political power to challenge the domination of the military-industrial complex. Well, Occupy Wall Street is also a massive, magic movement moment, a massive aha moment as well. And it will have a long-term impact on the political atmosphere and our organizing of a new kind of movement. Think about it. Millions are discussing the systemic nature of inequality, poverty, and militarism and democracy. Occupy Wall Street is a social movement that the organized movements did not anticipate or initiate. Occupy Wall Street has opened up a huge political space for the peace, labor, the justice movements to organize in, to grow our movement, to grow the numbers of core activists and organizers. But what it reflects is that we are seeing the end of the model of single-issue silo organizing. We can't get what we really, really need in our communities or repair the damage of U.S. foreign policy without building up strategic alliances and relationships between the movements for peace and for justice. That's the meaning of Occupy Wall Street. We will not bring an end to the war. If we could have, we would have. Our movement for peace is devoted, hardcore folks like yourselves, all across the U.S., all across the world, but without strategic alliances with labor, with economic and racial justice groups, we cannot end the war. Of course, although we are entering the time when silo, single-issue organizing is coming to an end, of course, each movement, the peace movement, the labor movement, and so on, we must play our unique role, doing popular education on our issues, organizing action. But the peace movement will not be effective in this political moment unless our efforts are coupled with the search and taking every opportunity to stand in solidarity with other movements. In a moment when the U.S. empire is in decline, we must link the solutions, not the issues, the solutions, because the problems are systemic. Inequality, poverty, democracy, militarism, they are systemic problems. This morning, I was watching Canadian news, and I saw TV coverage of Teamsters, of Teamster members marching early this morning to defend Wall Street, to defend the occupiers from being evicted from the park. I cried. I cried because I realized that it's everyday people who are putting their bodies on the line, standing up for democracy, standing up to the most powerful moneyed interests in the U.S. When the labor leaders said to the Wall Street occupiers last week, you know, we have found each other, he was talking about the fact that we're coming together, that we have to take every opportunity for united action. And he was also saying that alone we cannot win, but united that we can. This is the new kind of peace and justice movement we have to build if we're going to finally, once and for all, end the war in Afghanistan, finally, once and for all, end the war in Iraq, if we're once and for all going to try to successfully close the 1,000 U.S. bases around the world. It's about solidarity, it's about standing together, because war and militarism won't create jobs, it won't fund the services needed by the oldest, the youngest, and the sickest, and it won't repair the damage done by U.S. foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan from the occupations and wars. War isn't the answer, wasn't the answer 10 years ago to 9/11. Only organizing a militant new kind of peace and justice movement is. Thank you.